Our second speaker is Maggie. And Maggie is a leading volunteer with the American Academy of Actuaries, serving as the co-chair of its AI Data Science and Analytics Committee, which advances the actuarial profession's engagement in AI data science and advanced analytics and supports unbiased, objective actuarial input into public policy. Her health policy experience includes serving on Academy's Health Equity Committee and other Academy's health committees. A career as a actuarial professional with over 25 years of experience in Medicaid, Medicare, Medicare Advantage, and commercial health insurance markets. Maggie currently serves as the chief actuary at Humby AI by Innovator, where she leads the actuarial team. Thank you, Maggie, for joining us. I will hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me all right, I hope?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you for having me today. Really appreciate it. On behalf of the Academy, we're, excited to share the work we're doing with, other members and, the people that our work impacts. So, appreciate having me here today. Just quick, they already told you who I am, where I come from, so I'll kind of jump past that one. Just a quick note, the statements and opinions are my own. I'm here to represent the Academy, but these are not their official statements. It's kind of the standard we have to do. So next, just kind of real quick, kind of the agenda for, this next hour. I'm going to give you a little background on the Academy. Then we'll talk about what is algorithmic bias, look at some case studies, some of the harm and mitigation that can, be done from having algorithmic bias, talk about some regulatory responses and some resources that are out there, and then open it up for Q&A. So also I was asked on behalf of the Academy just to kind of remind everybody, that, it was founded in 1965 with key goals is to promote the actuarial professionalism and self-regulation. We are one of the few professional, organizations out there that are self-regulated. So that's really an important thing that, we maintain. We represent qualified actuaries of all specialties. We also are part of the National Association for U.S. Actuaries and Voice of Public Policy Issues. And currently we have roughly over 20,000 individual actuaries as members. So, just wanted to make sure everyone understands, kind of where the Academy is coming from in that background. So next, one other thing is just on an administrative note, we wanted to remind everyone that there are new requirements for the Academy membership this year. Sorry, this has got a little screen showing here. It keeps blocking me. So before we dive into everything on algorithmic bias, they've asked me just to give you a quick reminder about the new Academy membership requirements that became effective on January 1. And these apply to members, to new members, not to members who maintain their MAA from previous years. And there's an FAQ section in the Academy website that will explain everything you might need to know related to this. So they just ask that we share that whenever we're speaking so everybody's up to date on these new requirements, especially as new members are joining us. So now we can jump into the fun stuff. So as part of our efforts to examine, actuarial practice and methods to assess algorithmic bias, the Academy's AI and Data Science and Analytics Committee, we started doing this series of papers on algorithmic bias and auditing algorithms for bias. So this is the first paper of a series of 3 on understanding how bias can impact and worsen unequal outcomes when developing algorithms used in critical decision making. There will be a second paper coming out later this year and then a third paper following. So paper number 1, though, is the foundational study of algorithmic bias. So let's start with what is algorithmic bias. So, what do we mean by that? On a high level, it's the systemic pattern of algorithms that can lead to unfair or unequal outcomes, often unintentional outcomes. Bias doesn't come from a single source. It can stem from the data we use, the way models are designed, or the broader societal context in which they operate. And now I'm going to give you guys some concrete examples and later slides to walk you through where these are coming from and how they develop. So, that's what we mean by algorithmic bias. It's that inherent prejudice, unintentional, and it could many, many sources. So, let's start with why is bias important? So, it's part of our qualification standards, and it's important as a required continuing education because, you know, with the way the world is developing, obviously we have a lot of algorithms we deal with. We've always dealt with algorithms, but they're becoming more complex and used in more deep ways throughout everything that we do and touch. So the qualification standard explains the reason for this requirement is because we play an important role in helping maintain the trust in financial security systems, products, and services. So this requirement is consistent with really helping to assure the public that actuaries will fulfill that role in the future with big data, AI, and the evolving regulatory and societal requirements will place with the new demands and expectations on how these will be used in our future. So let's start with some fun stuff. So here's a lesson learned in algorithmic bias, so to speak, from a famous story. So we'll start with Captain Edward Smith. He was a highly experienced captain, and on his very last voyage across the sea before his retirement, he was captaining the Titanic, the unsinkable ship, the safest and most advanced model ever built. By every conventional measure, the model of this ship was very sound. So what went wrong? Was it the iceberg? It was seen. Why would that be something that could go wrong? But it was the risk underneath the surface that was underestimated. The iceberg underneath the surface caused damage to the foundation of the ship. It was hidden. It was unseen, but it had the power to rip the entire model apart. And so, that's kind of it's, analogous to, thinking about algorithmic bias. It's important. On the next slide, we'll look at the NIST, National Institute Statistics Training there for AI bias iceberg, also known as the iceberg principle, which shows how the most dangerous risks or biases in algorithmic systems are often the ones that remain hidden beneath the surface. So when we think about that hidden problem, we go over here, and this is the iceberg principle in and of itself. So if we look at the different types of bias and the work surrounding and defining them, the National Institute of Standards and Technology has defined three categories of bias regarding the iceberg principle. The section above the waterline represents the statistical biases. Just below the line is where the human and cognitive biases come in, and at the deepest depths of the iceberg appears systemic bias. Um, Statistical bias is basically the mismatch between the results of the statistical study and the actual population. It is intended to represent collection design. It's our actual to expected analysis, easily seen and mitigated. Next are the cognitive biases. These are what really occur when we interpret our world through that lens of our own experience and beliefs. These are where that human element comes into everything. They provide shortcuts for us to take on new information. Some bias, one thing to always keep in mind is not every bias is bad. And so as we're talking about bias in general, it's not bad to have biases, but it's just you have to be cognitive, once again, of those biases and what that and filter that how they mean and how they help choose your actions and the way you do things. So these shortcuts, though, can be faulty, and that's why you really have to do that analysis. And then the last is the systemic bias. So these are the biases that results from procedures and practices that operate in a way which result in certain social groups being advantaged or favored and others being disadvantaged or devalued. Institutional racism and sexism are some of the most common examples of systemic bias in our society. So now we're going to take a look at another example. This is kind of that cognitive bias example. So this is called the framing effect. So the framing effect is a common cognitive bias in which decisions are influenced by the way information is presented. It's especially noteworthy in combination with what's called the Simpson's paradox. Simpson's paradox is a phenomenon in which a trend can seem seemingly appear or disappear depending on how data is grouped. Taking into this example from COVID-19 pandemic, the data released in the August 21 report from Israel shows the table, and it was inferred that more severe cases of COVID-19 were among vaccinated individuals. 301 were hospitalized at that time, than in unvaccinated individuals, where only 214. There were no incidence rates reported. They were just reported as the raw statistical numbers, which led social media and others to conclude that the vaccines were actually ineffective. But then when we look at these numbers in another light, that hence the Simpsons paradox view of it, these numbers were looked at as a total population. We saw it's really an opposite information, that the unvaccinated were more likely to be hospitalized as a severe case than the vaccinated. But when you look at them in isolation of just the count of the numbers and not as an incidence, obviously you can draw the wrong information and infer the wrong things. So that's where that kind of cognitive or framing comes in, and you have to be very cognizant of that from a bias perspective. Um, so then we think about, okay, set the scale there. So now what are some of the different types of algorithmic harm? So the process of kind of creating an algorithm relies on data, machine learning, observed data. It's used to train a system, enabling it to learn and interpret various activities, allowing it to predict our future outcomes. That's basically what, we're trying to do. The quality and accuracy of that data, was really directly impacts how the algorithms developed and trained. The process focuses on designing algorithms to interpret the data from what is observed and to predict future outcomes. So what happens if the data is flawed or embedded with bias? As actuaries, we've always relied on historical data to help us predict the future. However, that historical data may unintentionally reinforce stereotypes that impact underserved or disregarded segments of the population. So these limitations really in the data can lead to what is defined as algorithmic harm. Algorithmic harms are basically unintended negative consequences or loss of equitable outcomes that are driven by the design and data used to develop an automatic decision, making technological systems. So the future of privacy forum has grouped those algorithmic harms into kind of four main subcategories defined as the following. So one is loss of opportunity. Essentially, this is kind of a broad category that refers to harms that occur within, workplace, housing, social support systems, healthcare, and education. An example of such of a loss of opportunity was, we looked at a study that was used as an algorithm for predicting which patients could benefit from extra care. It was less accurate for Black patients compared to white patients, which led to potential loss of early detection and intervention in Black patients who may not have received that necessary care and treatment that they may have needed. So they lost that opportunity. The next type of algorithmic harm that we look at is economic loss. So this category obviously, kind of refers to harm that's primarily causes financial injury, and can cause discrimination in the marketplace for goods and services. A kind of a high level example of that is the use of algorithms in medical billing and coding. The algorithms are designed to streamline submission and processing of claims, but can introduce errors and incorrect coding. These mistakes can result in denied claims, delayed payments, even fines for healthcare providers, as well as potential overbilling and underbilling, which can financially harm both patients and healthcare organizations. The third level of algorithmic harm is social determinant. So this category is really one that looks at harms to oneself or self-worth. These types of algorithms, really are talking about looking at some of those systemic types of biases specifically. So an example of these could be types of insurance offered, where algorithms are biased, or flawed, and can result in some consumers maybe being denied coverage or having limited options. And these have been found to have a disproportionate impact on marginalized communities where they are already facing barriers for accessing affordable insurance. The third type of algorithmic harms are loss of liberty, and it refers to harms that constrain physical freedom and autonomy. So algorithms like in the healthcare that can compromise patient privacy. So this is one where, you think about all of the algorithms we interact with on a daily basis, and especially those related to our health information. That's a vast amount of personal data. It's being used to make decisions about our health and risk for pricing, things like that. This is being accessed and shared without our individual consent, because we have a lot of things in our industry to help make sure things don't get, that PHI doesn't get shared where it's not supposed to. But at the same time, we are not giving explicit permission as individuals for this sharing. So these algorithms can be used and result in an individual's right to control your own personal information and make decisions about who has access to it. Algorithms are used in many different applications, and harms can manifest in any application or industry. So decision makers utilizing algorithmic outcomes must be aware of potential for algorithmic harms. Measuring the impact and determining the appropriate course of action to limit or mitigate those harms is a extremely complex challenge. Determining the extent of the harms is also difficult, as there's always a trade-off between, what we need, group needs, and individual needs. While there's no clearly defined acceptable level of harm, understanding the frequency and severity of those potential impacts is the first step towards reducing those unintended consequences driven by algorithmic harms. So now I want to jump into kind of giving you guys some case studies that we looked at that were really some very well-known examples of algorithmic harms or biases. The first one is the Amazon hiring algorithm. So this is powerful because there was nothing malicious intended in this. So Amazon in 2014 developed what seemed to be a pretty straightforward attempt to build an algorithm to automate the screening of their engineering resumes. It was aimed at efficiency. Reduce the human bias was their first thought. Let a machine look at it before anybody. Speed up hiring and consistently identify top candidates. So at face value, sounds great. Um, you know, I know many of us have heard, AI removes the human bias. So that's, one of the key phrases that's out there. Um, well, before deployment, the model was found to have some major issues. It showed that, this statement alone deserves a big asterisk because the system was never deployed. Amazon engineers noticed a troubling pattern. The algorithm consistently downgraded resumes associated with women. It penalized candidates who attended women's colleges, played women's sports, or used language commonly found in female resumes. Even the presence of the word woman itself became a negative signal. So, what went wrong? The algorithm was trained on their own historical hiring data. At the time, engineering roles at Amazon, much like the tech industry, were heavily male dominated. The model wasn't instructed to discriminate, it simply learned by looking at the past. Successful hires, which was what it looked at, and it optimized for similarity. So, here's the key insight. The algorithm didn't predict talent, it predicted historical preference. So another layer of buyer emerged through just language. Studies have shown that men and women tend to describe their work differently. Men more frequently use words like executed, captured, or driven, where women more often use words such as collaborated, supported, served, or assisted. Um, you know, these female words, quote, female words, I should say, are they really indicators of a lower ability? Well, of course not. Many would describe these skills actively we value teamwork, leadership, communication, but the algorithm tended to see these words as proxies for gender. And it's a critical takeaway because bias does not require protected abilities to be explicitly included. It enters through correlations, proxies, and historical imbalance. So from from a harm perspective, this case is a clear example of loss of opportunity. Qualified women were filtered out before a human even saw these resumes. There was economic harm also, because both individuals were denied high paying roles and the organization itself, through lost talent, innovation, and diversity of thought. Now, here's where this one, kind of becomes even more important. Amazon, was able to identify the issue before the algorithm went live, and ultimately they scrapped the system. That decision prevented real world harm. But many systems today are, deployed without that level of scrutiny. So, here's a very important question to think about. If this bias wasn't caught, who would have known? The rejected candidates, probably not. The hiring managers, if they didn't draw, if they didn't realize that they were only seeing, a very small percentage of female candidates, might not have, paid attention. Regulators, maybe if they did some kind of a study years later, or probably no one. And that's why algorithmic bias can also be described as that hidden risk. It operates quietly at a scale and often without clear accountability. Um, so this case kind of reminds us that model validation is not just statistical, it's ethical and professional. Testing accuracy of an AI model alone is not enough. We must ask, who benefits from this model? Who is excluded? What assumptions from the past are being carried forward and are no longer relevant? Algorithms don't just predict the future, they preserve the past unless we choose otherwise to make those changes. And that's why bias awareness, governance, and human judgment are not optional add ons when it comes to auditing algorithms. They're core of that responsible actuarial practice is an AI driven world. So I'm going to kind of talk us through another case study, and this one is specific to healthcare. Um, so this is looking at a model, this is a case where the model was accurate, but still unfair. It was designed to solve a practical problem. How do we identify patients who would benefit most from additional care management? Something we see a lot in all of our healthcare studies. It used a seemingly reasonable input, past healthcare spending, to predict future higher cost, meant higher risk. So if we think about that, healthcare cost a good proxy for risk? Something we look at all the time. And on paper, it often is. But here's the issue again, due to longstanding systemic barriers like access, affordability, and trust, Black patients historically spend less on healthcare, even though they may really be sicker. So the algorithm learned that lower cost meant lower risk. The model worked exactly as designed. It produced biased outcomes. Um, so once again, we see this, the future healthcare cost is a proxy of risk. Made sense. Historically lower healthcare spending due to access barriers, but the algorithm didn't understand that. So it assumed that they were healthier. So that impact yet again, it's a correlation there. It's bias can emerge even when the model is technically correct and produces biased outcomes. So again, some of those impacts that we see that loss of opportunity. Eligible patients are denied access to an enhanced care management program. And then that led to, can lead to that economic harm, delayed care, higher costs downstream. And, ultimately this one is, kind of also highlights that social determinant where existing racial inequities in the healthcare data just reinforced by that automated decision making. So, more importantly, race was never an explicit input, but the bias entered through a proxy variable, cost. And so it forces us to ask, for whom is the model accurate? So that's another way we need to think about when we're looking at and doing these is having that toolkit of who is this model intended to, represent, and is it accurate? And it also highlights why fairness testing and outcome reviews have to sit alongside that traditional validation. because it can pass every statistical test and still fail ethically, because Black patients in this case were about half as likely as equally sick white patients to receive that specialized care coordination. So here's some more studies that we've looked at related to algorithmic bias. ProPublica used computational journalists to do a study on disparities in cost in car insurance rating in 4 or 5 different states. But those computational journalists, wow, very well informed data scientists, they didn't have that full understanding of insurance specific requirements, which could lead to flaws in the assumptions. The New York hiring example. So online job applications had really led to a significant increase in the applications coming in, and hiring managers were feeling overwhelmed trying to review them. So they wanted to employ an automated process to sort candidates. But just like the Amazon study kind of showed, these automated processes are predictive models built on the history of the past. So with the AI automatically scanning resumes for keywords, having that predictive power into the quality of those future hires, they were increasingly understood as potentially being flawed. So because of that, New York actually passed Local Law 144 regarding automated employment decision tools. And basically, that law prohibits employers and employment agencies from using automated employment decision tools unless has been subject to a bias audit within 1 year of use of the tool. Information about the audit has to be made publicly available, and certain notices have been provided to employees or job candidates. So, really, this is coming to light in even, every day. Obviously, we're seeing this everywhere. So that's just a couple more examples. There are many, many out there. I mean, you could do a quick search for algorithmic harms and probably get Google pages. So next is kind of how are actuaries affected? So, as actuaries, we rely on complex algorithms every day. Our work relies on it. We, trust them. And the growth and utilization of AI to develop and process the data we are using causes us to rely on and requires a growing awareness of that potential bias in the data we are using. It can have significant implications. I've shown you a few just high level examples, but there are a lot out there. And those implications are both on companies and their customers. And the consequences can be far, far reaching, leading to unfair treatment of individuals, as well as resulting in financial and reputational losses. Biased algorithms could result in, inaccurate risk assessments, mispricing, affecting the affordability for consumers, and ultimately the profitability and sustainability of the company or a market. But algorithms alone do not create the bias. As bias requires that human element, but the underlying data used in the development of the algorithm can lead to unattended bias in the outcomes. So that's why actuaries play such a crucial role in mitigating the algorithmic bias. Um, you know, it's kind of, natural to ask, how are we affected? What can we do? And are we really affected? And yes, we are. At the core of our work, we model risk, making decisions under uncertainty, influencing those real world outcomes. And as algorithms and AI become more and more embedded in pricing, underwriting, reserving, forecasting, the potential for those bias just grows, directly and intersects with our professional responsibilities. So this isn't a future issue or a tech issue. It's very much an actuarial issue right now because we are seeing this every day in everything we touch. So how do you mitigate algorithmic bias? That's the big question, right? You've told me there's all this out there. What am I supposed to do about it? So, one way is raising awareness, which is why I'm here today. So addressing algorithmic bias requires kind of a multifaceted approach. You have to raise awareness of the problem and its potential consequences, within our actuarial world, but also within those you work with. So among stakeholders, developers of the different algorithms that you're working with. Policymakers, even the general public needs to understand this. And this can be achieved through education, training, public disclosures of information, and really fostering that shared understanding of the challenges and opportunities associated um, with algorithmic decision making. So that's kind of the first way to mitigate it. The second way is, improving data quality. Really, efforts focusing on improving that quality and the representativeness of the data we are using to train our algorithms is another step toward limiting that bias. Can involve collecting more diverse and inclusive data sets, as well as employing techniques such as data augmentation and synthetic data generation to mitigate the effects of underrepresentation and imbalances. If you think about that Amazon, example was talking about, if they had segmented things in such a way that you look at the different populations separately, that might have mitigated some of those. So that data quality is a huge piece of it. The third way to help mitigate those algorithmic bias is just refining the design. The design of algorithms require careful, thoughtful audit processes to identify and mitigate those sources of bias. And it's kind of an iterative process. So it involves the use of fairness metrics, evaluation frameworks, as well as the adoption of best practices in development, transparency, explainability, and accountability. As actuaries, we can also develop and use algorithms to help create societal benefits by exploring how to employ that technology for preventing accidents, mitigating losses, encouraging healthier, safer habits, and investigating ways to avoid or overcome those hazardous conditions with the goal of creating safer and healthier communities ultimately. And then the last way is really establishing a robust regulatory framework and standards to help govern and the deployment of algorithmic driven systems, which is a crucial step in reducing the impact of algorithmic bias. It also takes away the uncertainty. It involves creation of independent oversight bodies, legal safeguards, implementation of auditing and certification processes that are standardized across industries, and ensure that the systems are designed, developed, and operated in a manner that is fair, transparent, and accountable. So, from a regulatory perspective, there have been a number of regulatory responses over the last few years. And of course, they are coming about much more quickly every day. So what have been some of those responses? The oversight of AI systems, it's a regulatory priority, and regulators are devising tools to aid in this quest. So the first state to enact a law was Colorado. Colorado required insurance companies to demonstrate that their use of external consumer data and insurance sources and algorithms and predictive models was not harming consumers relative to access and affordability. So starting on it back in July of 2021, the governor at the time signed into law SB 21169. Insurers are required to comply with the law, and the law prohibits unbiased discrimination on the basis of race, color, national or ethnic origin, religion, sex, sexual orientation, disability, gender, identity, or gender expression in any insurance practices, including marketing, underwriting, pricing, utilization management, reimbursement methodologies, and claims management related to the transactions in insurance. It's important to note also that New York, Texas, and California have also developed regulatory tools that use AI systems by insurers. So other states, are obviously following suit. And then, the Academy has provided extensive cross-practice comments in that Colorado regulatory process, providing actual perspective on the law. And it continues to engage with other state insurance regulators on these as well. Then, start in December of 2023, the NAIC adopted the NAIC Model Bulletin for the use of AI systems by insurers. And the purpose of this bulletin is to provide state regulators with a tool to evaluate how insurance will govern their use of AI. It defines AI systems as machine-based system that can, for a given set of objectives, generate outputs such as predictions, recommendations, content, and other output influence decisions made in real virtual environments. AR systems are designed to operate with varying levels of autonomy. And it essentially addresses the AI principles, definitions, the board of directors oversight, senior management accountability, governance, the risk management related to, and internal controls for third party AI systems and data. It also outlines documentation, reporting, internal audit procedures, and testing. And currently, as of right now, there are about 24 states that have adopted the bulletin, and it's probably going, across the whole country as we speak. They also have the NAIC has put out the model toolkit, which has tools that regulators can use to also help, build and define their regulatory responses for AI systems within each state. So you can see here, kind of looking at who's adopted it in red, where insurance specific regulations are in blue, and then the gray is where it has not, as of April 2026, been adopted yet. But, obviously this gets updated regularly based on information from the NAIC's website. So this is kind of the most current view as of April. Below are just, if you want to take a deeper dive in kind of the data science toolkit. So this was kind of a high level of a foundational study of algorithmic bias. We've got some other papers out there defining big data, the discrimination in machine learning, and the actual view of bias for definitions, impacts, and considerations. We're also getting ready to publish the first AI use paper. So you can look at how AI is being used in different industry examples. And then, as I said before, this was the first in a series of 3 papers. So the next one will be kind of it's the next on the algorithmic bias of, how do we identify, how do we test for algorithmic bias? And that'll be coming out sometime later this year. So kind of just, these are the key takeaways that, we'd really like for you guys to have as you kind of wrap this up a little bit. So the first one is algorithmic bias is there and it has real world impacts. The consequences of that bias can be far reaching and profoundly impactful, whether it's, losing opportunity, financial impacts, social impacts, loss of freedoms. It has those real world impacts, and that's something to always keep in mind, that you can develop a perfect, from a model perspective, perfect algorithm, but it has to have that human element behind it to make sure that the algorithm is not unintentionally impacting, a marginalized population. Next, kind of key takeaway is that, by raising that awareness and improving our data quality and really refining our processes, establishing that regulatory framework, we can work towards limiting that impact of bias, of algorithmic bias, and developing systems that are fairer, more equitable across diverse populations, and really have a strong tool in our pocket to be able to, show as a self-regulating profession that we are there, we are on the forefront, we are always keeping track of all this, important information. And then lastly is just the professional standards and our, continuing education requirements in other academy work can help guide you in addressing that bias. And that's what, why I'm here, and why, as the AI data science and analytics committee, we are always looking at this, because we want to make sure that we keep at the forefront of all of this information, and, in a very rapidly changing field. So, just a couple things. One other thing I was asked to share is just a reminder that there are a couple of ASOPs open for comment. Comments are open for these exposure drafts until July 1. So there's ASOP 30 and 39 that are still open. And they just wanted me to share that in case anybody within your club's interested in kind of making comments and reviewing kind of those updates to those. And with that, here, these 2 are now also open. Health risk adjustment, Medicaid managed care, they're open till September 1st. So those are a couple of additional ASOPs that have additional open comment periods. So just, wanted to put that out there for everybody. And I think with that, I will take it for questions.
Thanks, Maggie. We do have a couple of questions. The first one is, what AI models do you see, if any, that you feel are among the best in terms of low algorithmic bias and should be held as a standard to aspire to?
That's a tough one. I'm constantly looking at different models, and I think they all need work. I don't think there's anyone that's out there that's great without having that actual oversight, honestly.
Okay. Next question is, the AI related biases seems like our biases that AI just learns from us, our experience data. Did we not have any tools to handle biases already and how they differ from the AI biases?
So the AI is basically learning off of the data we train it with. So, as humans, when we look at the way the granular level we look at data, for example, we can start seeing those patterns at a more granular level. If we don't teach the AI to look at that level of granularity, that's where we can see these biases be built within the algorithm. So if you go back to kind of that example I gave about the care coordination, if race was not one of the pieces that were fed into the algorithm to determine who should be receiving that extra care, then it was just going to automatically assume that there was a portion of the population that was sicker. But if you used race and did a segmentation there, which we would might maybe look at based on our experience and the way we look at as humans to think about the data versus the machine that's just looking at what it's fed, we would say, well, maybe we should be looking at a more granular level of information because this population is utilizing differently than this other population. And I think that's really the big key driver there. When it comes to having that toolkit, the machine is only as smart as what we teach it versus, we are looking at things, and it's looking at it in its silo where we are looking at, having that bigger picture view, having the years of experience and things like that. That really, I think, leads to um, not, we all have biases, we know that, but, it leads to being able to, as humans, we're looking at the bias in many, many lights where the machine is looking at everything in its silo.
Okay. Are other professions grappling with algorithmic bias or are actuaries in a unique position?
I think every profession that uses AI is kind of grappling with it. If you think about that engineering example I shared, that was not an actuarial one, that was a hiring example. So that was HR managers. I think anywhere you look that you're employing kind of that machine learning AI to help you understand how to make decisions, you're going to grapple with that level, some level of bias in there.
Yeah, thank you. You've mentioned segmentation a couple of times as a way to mitigate bias. Are there any other techniques to better train AI models?
I mean, really, I think segmenting the data and being able to understand well, it's not just the segmenting. It goes back to the human thinking. If you look at the world now versus the data you're feeding with, understanding just the differences in how the world, for example, global economy versus, a national economy. When we look at the way we, used to do any kind of planning, financial analysis and things, it was, the economy wasn't nearly as global as it is now. So you wouldn't see some of those impacts. So when you're building algorithms, you have to be able to have that forward thinking of, is the world now the same as it was when based on the data I'm building it on. And that's where you have to really have that, once again, back to the human element. And that's where it goes back, though, to segmentation. Is there a change in segmentation? Is there a change in or an adjustment that we need to do in order to reflect the world today versus the history of the data we're feeding in? Because it goes back to a very old saying, you have to understand history to not repeat it. And so that goes, you have to be able to have that understanding of what's changing and build that in as part of that algorithmic design. Otherwise, the data you feed it is just going to keep repeating the same processes.
Yeah. Okay. If, as an actuary, we are not familiar with the predictive models themselves and the technical parts, would that make it hard to identify the bias of the models or still possible with actuarial experience?
So I think that gets back to understanding the data that's feeding your model and understanding what what outcomes you are expecting and how different those are from your expectations. So if your data is very high level and you don't understand how that model has been developed, then you're not going to understand what that outcome means. So I think not understanding your predictive model definitely will make it a lot more difficult. But I think understanding the underlying data in the model is even more crucial than understanding just the model itself.
Okay. Next question is, how can we test for protected characteristics if they are not allowed to be included in a questionnaire?
That's the tough one. So what we do, what we've looked at are things like looking at national statistics. So, just looking at, you know, the different national societal census data so, if I apply this split based on what the census says, say the racial impacts, for example, if a census impact shows it differently, does that align with what my data is looking like? Is one way to do it. Another thing that we've been talking about and looking at is when you look at, for example, you have your population and you're looking at those that are utilizing and those that are not utilizing. Are there things that you can draw and conclusions you can draw by just being able to look at that? Could it be that there's a specific, say, demographic, like area demographic that's not utilizing, and then be able once again to go back and look at some of those nationally available public use type files that talk about, say, the economic level in that area. So it may not necessarily show from a racial perspective, but you could maybe look at and draw conclusions based on the economics of a specific, zip code or things like that. If you can look at, is there a specific area that's not utilizing versus one that is, and maybe draw conclusions, help you to understand and draw conclusions to ensure that there's no bias there from that.
The last question we have is, can AI be trained to recognize bias in its training data?
I don't think it can be trained to recognize bias in its training data. I think that's definitely one of the big things the human is for, because bias is a human element. It's not a machine. I think that I made that statement earlier too. Bias is definitely human. But I think what the training data can be used, the human has to be the one that trains it. So it's removing that bias from the human element and really being able to understand and look at those underlying pieces.
Okay, thank you. So that was the last question.
All righty.
Okay, yeah, I don't see any other questions. So thank you so much, Maggie, for your presentation.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
It was definitely interesting, and we will have the slides on our website once all our sessions are over this week. And yes, this concludes our day 2, and we will continue with our day 3 tomorrow, starting at 11 a.m. Central again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.